This is the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast, a podcast brought to you by two physical therapists devoted to helping physical therapists and other healthcare providers become better educators to patients, students, the community, and each other by interviewing prominent and passionate people within the realms of healthcare and education. The Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast is intended literally for educational and entertainment purposes only. No clinical decision-making should be based on only one source, and therefore this podcast should not be used as personal medical advice. While care has been taken to ensure accuracy, occasionally mistakes and factual errors can be present, as we are only human. This is our journey on the road to becoming better educators, so get ready with your pen and paper as class is about to begin.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast. I'm your host, F. Scott Field, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Brandon Pone. We are here today to discuss the topic of International Doctorate of Physical Therapy programs with Dr. Roger Kerry. Roger, would you mind giving our audience a little bit of an introduction to yourself and a little bit of your bio?
Sure. Thanks, Scott. My name is Roger Kerry. I'm a chartered physiotherapist from the United Kingdom. I work at the University of Nottingham, which is right in the middle of England. I've been qualified a long time and generally work in teaching and research, some clinic practice, consultation practice. My areas of interest are initially developed from the musculoskeletal field. I think it's sort of broader and wider than that now. I'm interested in the whole movement in pain science and how that impacts on the history of what we've done. Clinical reasoning, evidence-based practice. My doctorate was a philosophy thesis on the nature of evidence and causation in evidence-based medicine. So fairly broad range of interests.
Awesome. I love that. Roger, would you mind giving our audience a little bit about your academic journey and how it led you to where you are today?
Yeah, so I guess the academic journey started, I was working as a clinician, what was called in England at that time, extended scope practice. And so I was doing that full time, and the place where I was working, which was York, they started a new physiotherapy education program in the university that was close by the hospital, and they were looking for people to join them and do some part-time teaching. So I started doing 1 day a week teaching, good old clinical teaching, which was really good fun and really enjoyed it. And I decided that I probably would like to get into the academic field a bit more seriously, and eventually got an academic post at the University of Nottingham. And so just maintained that interest ever since, really, and never trying to lose or never really been motivated to move away from the clinical importance of this silly to do, because it's all about the shop floor and clinical practice, but it's keeping that link as we expand out into other areas and keep bringing things back into, this is what it means for you working clinically, and this is what it means for you trying to address the health of populations as well. So, the idea of facilitating learning and looking and doing research in these areas is really quite motivating to me.
Awesome. And Roger, I also want to take a moment just to say how thankful we are, as a profession for the work that you and Al have tailored done regarding cervical artery dysfunction, because we've definitely learned a lot about that and manipulation with neck pain and headaches from a lot of your work. A lot of that's been pretty game changing. Like I didn't learn all that. I didn't learn too much about that in school, but going to courses and learning your research, I was like, holy smokes, there's a lot on this that I never knew. So, that changes a lot about how we think. So first of all, I want to say thank you for that. And do you think let's dive right into kind of the main topic of today. And that's kind of this and kind of international DPT education or physiotherapy. So do you think you could tell our audience about how physiotherapy programs and curriculum are generally structured across the pond?
So generally, in England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland, we have either a 3-year or a 4-year programme. Mainly in England, it's a 3-year programme, the standard programme. So it's a full-time Bachelor of Science degree programme, which also accredits, if you're successful in that programme, you are eligible for registration to our regulating body, which is the Health and Care Professions Council, and you can become a chartered physiotherapist So then you're qualified. So the way those 3 years are structured are obviously a mix of academic contact time and clinical practice. The program we run at Nottingham, for example, is typical. So 1 year full-time study would be spent in the school learning fundamental principles of physiotherapy and knowledge without any clinical practice. And then over the second and third year, there's an integration of we do 4-week placements, and then they're back in the university for 4 weeks, and they just alternate that until the end of the course. So there's up to about 35 or 40 weeks of practice all in all within that 3-year program. And different institutions will structure their delivery of content quite differently in terms of the modular construction of the whole program, and different institutions might have a slightly different emphasis on. But basically, so we have musculoskeletal modules, neuro rehabilitation, cardiorespiratory modules, and then running through all that, we have things like evidence-based practice and personal professional development. So transferable skills that sort of cut through the whole 3 years. So obviously the main difference with you guys is it's shorter. It's a much shorter program.
Yeah, that actually brings up another question. Are you noticing any other differences between the American DPT program and the international physio programs in relation to like cost or anything curriculum wise that we're learning that might be different?
Well, I'm sure that the cost to qualify in the UK is a lot less than the absolute cost to people in the US. Although I don't know all the details, but from what I can gather and what I've heard and the conversations I had with it is financially the absolute cost is a lot different. It's a lot cheaper here, and obviously it's a shorter program, so it would be. But I do think the cost of taught doctorate programs here in other professions is probably less than what you guys are used to.
Yeah, and
Sure.
you mentioned that you end up in a qualifying situation, right? Does that when you graduate from a physio program, does that give you a doctorate of physiotherapy?
No, we don't. There are doctorates of physiotherapy, but they're research doctors, so we could perhaps come back to that. But once somebody qualifies, they become a chartered physiotherapist. They're not a doctor of physical therapy or physiotherapy. They're not a master of physiotherapy. They've got a Bachelor of Science degree, and they're a chartered physiotherapist. And then if they choose to go on to something else, that's another story. Should I say, perhaps I could come back to that. But essentially, you go for 3 or 4 years and you qualify just with a bachelor's degree and become a regulated chartered physiotherapist. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that does make sense, Roger. And when you said before, overall, generally speaking, the cost is a little bit less compared to how it is in the U.S. I'm kind of curious too. Is on average the national salary for a PT in the UK, is that different than how it is in the US?
So I think the starting salary for a physiotherapist, I could be wrong in this, and somebody's obviously going to chip in here with comments when this goes out because I've got it slightly wrong, but it's just 20-something thousand pounds in the low 20s, maybe 23,000-24,000 pounds a year. But please, somebody correct me on that. But it's around there. Okay, so the cost for the training is this country has just gone through a whole revision of how university education is funded. So up until recently, you could train as a physiotherapy and get the majority of your costs covered by the government. That has now changed in the last 2 or 3 years. So students are responsible for their own costs, which are £9,000 a year tuition fees plus obviously other costs. So £27,000 3 years plus other costs, going into a starting salary somewhere in the low to mid £20,000 a year.
Yeah, Roger, you talk about the government there. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about how the healthcare system is structured over there? So once you graduate and you're qualified to be a physiotherapist, for the most part, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the healthcare system over in England there, it's free to the public essentially, right? I mean, you're paying into it, but how does the government structure the healthcare system for physios specifically?
Okay, so as it stands, and this could all change very soon, we're undergoing massive change in the system, but traditionally, since the 1940s, we've had something called the National Health Service, which you would have heard of, the NHS. So this is our countrywide single health service, which started on a sort of premise and an intention of providing free healthcare for every individual from cradle to grave. Now, as you say, it's not exactly free because our taxes contribute towards it, but it's free in the sense that if you are ill or injured, you go to a hospital or doctors and you have your treatment. There's no billing, there's no costs, regardless of the nature or chronicity or length or intensity of that care, and essentially that's it. Recently, there's been more private providers contributing to that free service, but we're starting to move towards a slightly different model now where there's the potential deconstruction of the NHS. But essentially, that's it. So we've had a good 67 years or whatever of free healthcare for all.
Yeah, and I don't want to turn this into a political podcast here or anything like that, Roger, but what is the wait period for an average physiotherapy visit? Like, let's say I, sprain my ankle and I need physiotherapy. About how long am I looking on a wait list with free healthcare?
Yeah, so this is quite variable throughout the country because although we have one system nationally, it's organised and operated with some variation depending on where you are. Now, one aim is to try and standardise that, which is more difficult, but naturally some areas will be busier than others. So it's hard to give you an absolute average, and some systems work very well. So if you were in Nottingham and you sprained your ankle and you went to either the emergency department or your doctors, you would probably get seen within the day or the day after at the latest. Some places you might wait longer than that. If you complained to your GP about your chronic low back pain, then again, there are specialist services in some regions that would fast track you to some sort of pain management program almost immediately. Sometimes there'll be a wait, and on the opposite side, probably the worst cases that we hear about are people waiting for 6 or 7 weeks for an appointment for something non-urgent and non-critical, maybe even longer. But the idea is the health service wants to limit waiting times because it uses one of those as a metric for its performance, by which it then attracts further funding. So it's in the system's interest to minimise things like waiting time.
Interesting. That's an interesting perspective on that. And, Roger, I'm going to kind of bring it back a little bit to kind of talk more about physiotherapy programs. And, in your opinion, is there anything that you think that international programs should adopt from the U.S. programs? And basically, is there anything you think the U.S. programs are doing right that you think should be adopted overall?
Well, yeah, I do. But bear in mind, my knowledge of the detail of your program is limited and informed mainly by conversations with probably atypical physiotherapists who are highly motivated and very knowledgeable and skilled that you come across on social media and such like. So I think there are some strengths to the doctorate program in the US that we can definitely learn from. And I suppose one of those is the depth and detail you go into some areas, which from my understanding, in some areas is probably a lot more than we do. To take it to a level that we would probably reach when we do postgraduate education, which is an optional career choice for a physiotherapist. Nobody's obliged to do postgraduate education, but if you entered a master's program of physiotherapy, we talk about advanced levels of practice and extended knowledge and scope of practice. And I think some elements of that you probably include in your doctorate program. So on average, your DPTs, and I'll probably get shot down by a lot of UK physios for this, but I would say from what I know, on average, your qualifying DPTs are more skilled and knowledgeable in some areas at least than our qualifying Bachelor of Science physiotherapists, who then have to go and learn more on the job or do postgraduate education to bring them to that level. That's the purpose of having a longer doctorate program.
Yeah, that's a pretty good point, Roger, I'm curious, are you noticing any differences with any of the U.S. trained physical therapists that you're seeing versus, physiotherapists internationally, as far as, like you mentioned, maybe knowledge base or more so in the clinic, treatment styles or anything like that may differ?
I think overall there's a confidence dimension, and it seems that you guys seem to be more confident in who you are in your professional identity and where you're going, which links into the knowledge base and skill set and everything else. In terms of treatment approaches, I'm guessing there's a lot of similarities, but so in the musculoskeletal field or the neuromusculoskeletal field, the real differences, I guess you're more tuned into, well, again, this is my perception. It seems to be that you are more acutely driven by the evidence base in terms of directing things like use and extent of use of something like manual therapy, for example, where you would readily talk about the relationship of your clinical practice in relation to the latest studies from Josh Cleland or whatever. It seems to be that level of conversation that DPTs have, and our graduates probably aren't so keenly attuned in that way, and they would talk more about what they've been taught at college, and that's why they do things. So there seems, you might have a very different perception, but it seems like DPTs in the US are more able and willing to think critically about their practice and be directed more acutely by the evolving evidence base. So that's just my perception.
Yeah, no, I love that take on it. And Roger, you talked about, finishing up your program and qualifying. What do physios internationally go through once they finish their schooling? Is there like a board exam to get qualified, or how does that work?
All the examination is within the program itself. So once you qualify, you're qualified. Once you qualify from the degree program, you're qualified as a physiotherapist. There isn't then a layer of board examination that you need to qualify. So conceptually, there used to be that a few decades ago, but now everything is embedded in the degree program. So you come to the University of Nottingham, you're here for 3 years to do a Bachelor of Science degree, and as part of that, all your examination for qualification is included. So our examinations are essentially what were board examinations, but they're part of the degree. So once you're done, you're done. That's it. You're qualified.
Interesting. Wow, that's not what I would have thought, but that's an interesting thought there. And and Roger, for let's say a student completes an international program, and what would they do then, or what would they have to do if they decided they wanted to treat in a different country? Like what would they need specifically to come over? Like if they wanted to practice in the U.S. or a different country, what would they need to do in order to make that happen?
Yeah, so there's the challenge, and it's getting more and more visible now that we compare our programs against yours. So if a UK trained physiotherapist wanted to work in the US, then there's a whole bunch of, and again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know if this is state specific or not. I think it is from my experience, but it just varies on the extent of it, of further examination. But I know there's a whole layer of additional examinations a UK trained physiotherapist would need to go through to work in the US, Canada, and Australia particularly. My understanding is there are many other countries that they can go to work without additional examinations. But for the US, Canada, and Australia, there's a whole level of exams that a UK physiotherapist will have to go through. From my understanding, they're fairly substantial examinations and really take quite a lot of commitment and time to get through.
Interesting. That's an interesting take, Roger. And kind of got to switch gears a little bit to kind of more of your daily schedule, with you doing research and teaching. And, and we've had a few people on the podcast already that have discussed kind of how they do research and teach here in the US and kind of how they balance that. But I'm really curious to hear how that process is for you in the UK, just to see if there's any differences or similarities between the US here.
Well, this links a lot to the way universities are funded. Okay, now bear with me. So the funding of universities is based on their performance in different areas. And traditionally, up until very recently, the last 2 years, universities have generally been funded on their research performance. So, what that means for an academic on a daily basis coming into work, they would try to get established on a research contract, do their best to perform well in research in terms of conducting good quality research and having good output publications from that. And then they will progress their academic career like that. And the teaching side would be almost secondary to that. So the emphasis would be very much on research, with teaching as a sort of an output and an aside for the research, which is a traditional idea of the university. You discover something, then you tell students about it. But for a vocational course like physiotherapy, that traditionally gives some challenges and problems, because there needs to be good tuition and there needs to be good contact, clinical contact with students and coaching and guiding, which leaves less time for research. Now, what's happened over the last 2 years, the government's introduced a separate assessment measure for universities based on teaching. So now we have a research excellence framework and a teaching excellence framework. What that means for somebody working in the university is there's got to be equal emphasis on the quality and the extent of your teaching, because that's how the government will measure the success of the university. So that's good news, really, for a vocational course like physiotherapy, because that's where the emphasis should largely be in terms of training people. So it gives us some validity in terms of teaching. Now, you can then choose or be directed towards having a contract, an employment contract that's more research or more teaching, or a combination of both. But as I say, I think overall that's a positive thing, because it's starting to value the teaching content university courses. So for someone like me, my emphasis is on teaching anyway, with research activity secondary to that. So that's good news. So I would strive to be the best facilitator of learning I can, and add the research within that through either student projects or externally funded projects or whatever.
Interesting. No, that was a good take there, Roger, especially because that opened my eyes to a few things that I had no idea. And you touched on a few of the pros there in terms of those kind of changes there. But I'm curious now to kind of see, what do you think are some of the cons or limitations of that, of coming with that model? And what do you think that the next step needs to be to kind of help plug those gaps a little bit, if there are any?
Yeah, I did put a positive spin on it. At the same time, everybody's been quite anxious and worried about this, because what it's essentially trying to do is reduce teaching activity into measurable component parts, which people may focus on to the cost of the real sort of quality of their teaching. So for example, student feedback, evaluation of teaching by students is a really strong metric that the universities are using. Now, the literature suggests, and you can see it in real life anyway, that short-term student feedback of their teaching experience isn't necessarily at all related to what they've learned. So you could end up with a situation where teachers are starting to appease and acquiesce to students' short-term needs just to get good feedback at the cost of good quality education. So giving the students what they want in a really easy way, not making them think too hard, not challenging them, because then a student will say, I had a really good class, I was told everything, it was short, didn't have to think, I'm going to give great feedback. And that's one real worry of having teaching as a measurable performance dimension of a university. There are consequences on people's contracts if they're not performing that well. Teaching does take years to get good at and develop. Sometimes you're bad and sometimes you're good, but you develop. So if the short-term measures of that, it could have employability effects and morale. The system is having an effect on teachers' morale. They're under the microscope all the time now, and that's affecting confidence and morale and motivation, increasing the general level of anxiety university teachers.
Yeah, I think we call that burnout over here in the States, Roger. I think it's very common in the healthcare field, but I could see that being kind of a downtrodden on the academic realm as well. Roger, I'd like to switch gears now a little bit towards teaching a little bit more and focus a little bit on course layout and structure. You teach evidence-based practice along with other courses as well. From your perspective as a researcher or educator, what do you believe is some of the best methods to teach evidence-based practice to physio students in terms of course curriculum and methods?
I think we're all still learning on this, even though the concept's been around for 2 or 3 decades now. I think the only way you can meaningfully encourage somebody to learn regarding evidence-based practice is to do it with clinical practice in mind, rather than sort of having discrete separated sections on this is what evidence is, this is what research is, this is different types of research methods and methodologies. You got to sort of right from the start engage the students in thinking, right, what's the clinical problem here? What's, with this case or with a number of cases, what's going on, and let that feed into a discussion about how you then inform your decision making. And actually some of that information comes from something that we call research evidence, and it's not so much of a surprise or a worry to somebody that I think we've made a few mistakes over the last 20 years or so, trying to separate it too much and have this special thing called evidence-based practice, which is different to your clinical practice. But you really should be a bit more like this evidence thing because that's where it's going. But that was never the case at all. So I think we're getting better at bringing that together now and just incorporating research evidence as another source of information into your clinical reasoning and clinical decision making, which is where it started anyway.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fantastic point there, Roger, and that seems to make a lot of sense. And kind of to switch topics here just briefly, and I realize this next question could be a wholly different podcast episode by itself, so I'm not trying to go too much down a rabbit hole there, just to kind of get an overall snapshot, to kind of give some perspective to both newer professors in the UK or internationally and the US. But like you were talking about before, in terms of starting up from being an educator and researcher, you're definitely under the scope a lot, and there's some challenges that you guys face. What would you recommend to a newer professor starting off doing the teaching research to kind of really help succeed, at least initially, to kind of help them avoid from getting cut?
I think you've got to, there's no doubt you've got to be desperately aware of how your performance as an employee is being monitored. But turn that into a very positive thing and work towards that and let that motivate you, not be scared by it. So you've got to do stuff well, and you've got to have evidence of doing it well, and that's fine. So work with that. Ideally, get good mentorship, get engaged in large research groups and large teaching support activities. Don't try to be a lone shot. Don't try to be a maverick. Sure, have independent ideas and challenge the system. Be your own person, and eventually that will lead you somewhere. But in order to survive, especially those early years, you got to be part of that system, and for want of a better phrase, you've got to play that system a bit. But really, it is all about doing your best, and then you're in a better position to sort of challenge whatever you feel should be challenged. But you've got to be aware of how, in this modern age, of how performance is being measured as an employee.
Gotcha. No, that makes a lot of sense. Got to play the game a little bit to be able to challenge it and change it. I totally hear you on that. And, Roger, we always ask this question at the end of each episode to kind of wrap up, because we're always curious to hear what everyone's thoughts are on this question. And the question is, if you could change one aspect of healthcare education, whether that be physiotherapy or other healthcare provider related, which aspect would you change, and how would you change it if you could?
Shall I tell you what I think? It's hugely biased because I do have an interest in philosophy. I did my PhD in philosophy, but I have thought for a long time that all education, but particularly the health sciences and very particularly physiotherapy, should be underpinned by some sort of training in the philosophy of science and critical thinking. And I think the way you could do that is this is my ideal world, is to have a foundation year before you start your degree program in the philosophy of science and critical thinking. And you have to get through that. So by the time you start to learn about your health science subject, you already know how to make sense of evidence. You already know how to make sense of your observations of real life practice. You already know how to synthesize information and to critically reflect and analyze and understand truth and what's not truth, I think that will make a massive difference to the way we develop.
Yeah, that's a great take on it, Roger. And I think you are the first guest actually to kind of bring in philosophy to the mix. I know a lot of people have mentioned kind of critical thinking skills and stuff, but yeah, the philosophy behind the critical thinking and how we're getting to the decisions we're making in healthcare, it's a very neat take on it. Roger, thank you so much for your time and for coming on to talk to us today. We really appreciate it. Would you mind telling our audience where they can reach out and find you online or on social media if they have any follow-up questions for you?
Yeah, sure. Well, you can just Google my name and it's at the University of Nottingham. So you can find my email and contacts that way. Ideally, check me out on Twitter at RogerKerry1.
Awesome. Well, Roger, thanks again so much for the time and the insight. I definitely learned a few new things, especially about international programs that I never knew. So thank you so much for all that insight, and, best of luck with everything across the pond, and hope everything continues to go well, man.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, for engaging me with this great project you've got going in. It's been an honor and a pleasure.
Oh, the pleasure is all ours. Thank you so much, Roger.
Thank you.
Thank you for attending class today, and we hope that you learned something and gained value from the content.
If you'd like to schedule office hours with us, feel free to add us on Twitter at HET Podcast, on Instagram, HET Podcast, on Facebook, the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast, and the homepage, healthcareeducationtransformationpodcast.com.
And for those of you following along in the syllabus, extra credit can be obtained by liking us, sharing us, and leaving a review.
Let's continue our journey up Mount Educational Success as lifelong learners.